Well, my given name is Ricardo Cornelius Martin. Growing up, I went by Rick. I was born in 1949 in Huntington, West Virginia, to a single mother, Miss Alma M. Kidd. Grew up on what is now Harrogreer Boulevard and 10th Avenue. When I was growing up, it was 16th Street and 10th Avenue. I was raised in what was predominantly an African-American community. I think on my street, we had one white family. I started my early education at Sims Elementary School. Most of the African-American children in our community went to Barnett Elementary School. Integration had come about by the time I started elementary in, I think, 1957. And my mother was a believer in, this is what you're going to have to deal with. So she sent me to Sims Elementary School. So I left, if you will, our little tight-knit community during the day and went to an integrated elementary school. And then, of course, in the afternoon, I returned to the African-American community. It was in walking distance. Of course, back then, we had no such thing as busing that I was aware of anyway. And but our community was tight-knit. I mean, the Huntington, West Virginia area for African Americans, it was essentially confined to about a 15, 20 block area from Harrogreer Boulevard to 20th Street. So that would have been 16th Street, 16th, 17th, 18th, 19th, 5 blocks. And from really 11th Avenue over to 8th Avenue. But within that confine, we had everything. Doctors, dentists, Cabell Huntington Hospital, a grocery store, the Big Bear. We had a movie theater, barbershops, schools, the well-known Douglas High School. So the thing that separated us was the Viaduct. You go into the Viaduct, you hit 7th Avenue, you are in now what is predominantly a white area. You go on over several more blocks, and there's Marshall University. At the time, it was Marshall College. And then the downtown area, which we had very few occasions to venture downtown, mostly on Sundays, to the movie theater. We had three movie theaters, the Keith Albee, the Palace, and the Orpheum Theater. Of course, we could only go to one, and that was the Orpheum. Couldn't go to the Palace, couldn't go to the Keith Albee. And when we went to the Orpheum, we had to sit up in the balcony. You couldn't sit on the African Americans couldn't sit on the main floor. Now, if any trouble took place between, racial issues, we had to make it to the Viaduct, because once we got to the Viaduct and went under the Viaduct and hit 8th Avenue, we were home. We were safe. But it was just a phenomenal childhood. We thought we had everything. We had some of the best African American teachers, I believe, that were ever produced. No, at Barnett and at Douglas. But I don't remember there being any African American teachers at Sims. Maybe close to my 6th grade year. I'm thinking maybe Miss Duff She was an English teacher. She may have, but I don't think so. You know, I had no problems. I had what I thought were some fantastic teachers, Caucasian teachers, and Miss Pollard. She was married because she was Indian, but she was just, I loved her. I Miss Garland. I had some excellent teachers, but then going back to the community and being around educators, because our community was full of educators. I mean, I remember vividly Mr. Joseph Slash. You probably know Joe Slash. He was a principal at Douglas High School and went on to be the first African-American superintendent of schools in Cabell County Superintendent of Schools. Miss Barnett, Miss Cobb, just teachers, educators everywhere. Mr. Simpson, I had him at Ole Junior High when Douglas was closed, and African Americans that attended what was then an all-black high school, then we were forced, not forced, but then we attended Huntington High School, and Ole Junior High School is where the African American students went. That was quite a jaunt now. I mean, because from our community to Ole Junior High, where I had to go under the viaduct and go close to downtown, it was about 14 blocks. No busing. In wintertime, it was fairly difficult, but we made it. And the same was true when I went to matriculated from junior high into high school and started at Huntington High. It was about 10, 12 blocks to get to high school. But my childhood was such that even in the midst of blatant, covert racism, our community found a way to shelter us, to protect us. I was a member of the youth NAACP, and I can remember vividly, and because my mother was secretary of the Cabell County branch, the Huntington branch of the NAACP, and I can remember vividly picketing, protesting out in front of an establishment downtown called the White Pantry. And we were protesting because we couldn't go in there and eat. You couldn't go in there and I remember it became a real challenge to me, and I told my mother, I said, I don't think I can do this. When a white kid spit on me, when I was outside, our youth branch was outside picketing in front of the White Pantry. And I can remember the anger that I felt. And that was really one of my first real confrontations as it related to racism. Now, my dad, because mom and dad never married, I mean, I was raised by a single parent, but I had a relationship with my dad. He was the owner and operator of Martin's Transfer and Storage, which was, at the time, my recollection, I know he was the only African American in Huntington and all of Cabell County that was a entrepreneur, businessman in that venue, transfer and storage. And I grew up, man, on that moving truck every weekend. We did 2 or 3 household movies, and primarily, of course, within the black community. And of course, Marshall would be playing football, and I would say, "Dad, we gonna be through in time for?" "Oh yeah, we just got a couple of 7 o'clock that night." We get, me and my brothers, we getting off the truck, so we spent the whole day doing household movings, and generally for African Americans, it was from an upstairs apartment to an upstairs apartment, stoves, refrigerators, hide beds, weighing heavy stuff. But Dad spent, I don't know, all of his working life in that profession. And he also drove for U.S. Van Lines, United States Van Lines. Now, I did go with him on one trip. He did a lot of military moves, and that would involve, stopping in different states and picking up a family, and with those big 18-wheelers, you might get 2 or 3 families. So we would hopscotch. Well, I went with him one time to Florida, to Fort Lauderdale. The first time I'd really ever been out of state. And I was probably 13, 14. And I went with him, and I never shall forget, we were in South Carolina doing these military moves. And we stopped at this truck stop and to get gas. And, man, I had to go to the bathroom. And I said, well, Dad, I'm going on in. And he said, wait for me. And I saw the sign, restaurant. And I said, well, I said, wait. And I could tell by the tone of his voice, I better wait. So he gassed the truck, and then he heads off down and I said, Dad, the rest, he said, just come with me. And I followed him. We went around the building to the back, and it was a little screen door. And we went in, and there were little tables and chairs set up. And he said, we can't eat in the restaurant. We have to eat here. We can't use the bathroom in the restaurant. Now, this was 1960. This was in the 60s. And that night, we were driving, it was getting dark, and he's nodding, and I'm saying, Dad, 18-wheeler, man. And so he pulls over finally. He pulls over on the side of the road, and he said, let's get a few hours sleep. He said, I'm going to put you in the back. And if you hear anything out here, don't you say anything. Don't make any noise. I don't want anybody to know you're back here. And so I strapped myself in, strapped the tailgate closed. But that was, I'm saying, what is this about, Dad? This was new to me. Brand new. The overt. There wasn't nothing covert about this. This was overt racism. No, you can't eat here. No, you can't get a drink of water out of that fountain. I had never experienced that, and so much so that I was out there on the road with him about a week. Never shall forget. 4th of July. I ain't never been away from home 4th of July. In our community, we cooking out and having a celebration. And 4th of July, we sitting up in the cab of the truck eating fried chicken and watermelon. And so we dropped off the load in Fort Lauderdale, Florida. He called the agent, U.S. Van Lines, said, I'm headed back to West Virginia. You got anything going my way? The agent said, no, closest thing I got, Mr. Martin, is Bangor, Maine. Dad said, I'll take it. And I'm young, but I knew enough to say, Dad, where is Bangor, Maine? How far? Son, it's about 1,200 miles. No, they put me on the bus. I'm going home. And he did. At Winston-Salem, North Carolina, he put me on a Greyhound bus, and I'd had enough of that experience. Of course, my grandmother and them, they weren't too happy. How could you leave your daddy out there on there? He'll be all right. Don't worry about it. But and then my experience at Huntington High School. Now, it was good. It was good. Well, yeah, that made a difference. Playing sports obviously made a difference, but the undergirding was always the community.
What about the church?
My church.
What
Well,
church played a role?
oh, my church. Now, my church made me. I really believe my church made me what I am today.
What church was that?
First Baptist of Huntington, West Virginia. And believe it or not, it was at the time, it was the only African American church situated in what we would consider downtown. It was on 6th Avenue and 8th Street. Wasn't any other African American churches. Most of the African American, all of the other African American churches were in the community, in the 8th Avenue and 16th Street area. Fairfield West was, we didn't refer to it as Fairfield West back then. I mean, that's a present day term. It was just 16th Street. You know, anybody say, well, 16th Street. Well, 16th Street was, and the thing that the unique thing about our community, you had to go through it to get to the hospital. You had to go through it to get to Marshall College. So we were like a thoroughfare. But the church, I mean, and for us in the African American community, particularly for the youth, there wasn't any question about where you were going to be on Sundays. You were going to be in Sunday school, you were going to be in church, and if you weren't going to be seen on Sunday because you're going to be in the house. And the movie, of course, you know, Sunday was our movie day, but you had to go to church if you were going to go to the movie. And my experience at First Baptist, I was baptized at 7 years old by the Reverend W. Temple Ritchie. I never shall forget him. And as a matter of fact, on 10th Avenue, I lived right across the street from him. His wife, Aurelia Ritchie. His son, Temple. And Temple was one of my best friends. He was several years older than me. But Temple was I consider him to this day, I consider him one of my best friends. He had two sisters, Gloria and Tina. Miss Ritchie gave piano lessons. You know, and all the kids, you know, that were into that would go. Of course, I consider myself an athlete, and, you know, only sissies did piano lessons. And we used to kid them if they were, yeah, go on, little sissy. But let me fast forward to my high school days. The church was always a part of my life. We had an elementary, a junior high, and a senior high Baptist Youth Fellowship. And of course, I was in all three as I grew. I started elementary, I got to junior high. I went, you know, kind of like school. You graduate to the junior high, and then when you hit senior high, you graduated to the senior high. But fantastic high school experience. I played football. I was a three-letter man. Played football, basketball, and baseball, and was fortunate enough my senior year upon graduation to be offered a grant and aid 4-year football scholarship to attend West Virginia University. And as I look back on it, I was the first African American from that high school to attend WVU on a football scholarship. Paul Congleton, who was a couple of years ahead of me, I think was offered a scholarship in basketball. He was a tremendous football player too, but his offer was in basketball. So that was in 1967. There was a significant, if you will, difference in what we experienced as athletes versus what the African American non-athlete, the student experienced. Because our days and evenings were pretty much regimented. We had to go to class. We had to go to study hall every evening, Monday through Thursday, from 7 to 9:30. We had bed check every night. We had to be in our rooms by 11 o'clock. So a lot of stuff was going on with what was called back then, and they formed it it was the Black Unity Organization. And this was a group of African American students who came together. We had to. I mean, that was really our social outlet, coming together, because there were so many places in Morgantown at the time that students, African American students, non-athletes, would feel uncomfortable going because there was sure to be something said, something done, if not an outright denial of entrance. We didn't experience that as athletes, and for the most part because not only were we prohibited. I mean, you're not going into bars. You're not going into some of those places where alcohol is served, and you just didn't do it. Now, I tell you what made a difference for us as African Americans during that time was the African American community, believe it or not, over on White Avenue and in Osage, where there were black families. And I can remember as an athlete, many of us had kind of been adopted. Jim Braxton, Bob Gresham, Carl Cornell, Oscar Patrick. We had almost standing invitations every weekend to go over to the White Avenue section of Morgantown for dinner with some of the African American families who recognized, and not just athletes, but non-athletes too, who recognized that I'll say our dilemma. There were less than 100 of us on campus at that time, and my group, when I signed to attend school, I signed with Jim Braxton, who was eventually an All-American and drafted by the Buffalo Bills, ran in the backfield with O.J. Simpson, and Bob Gresham, who was drafted by the New Orleans Saints. I mean, I came in with some very, very talented athletes. Roy Stanley from Atlanta, Georgia, and then myself. That was the four in 1967. The year before, I think that was the first time they had signed 4 African Americans at the same time. The year before, it was Carl Cornell and Oscar Patrick. They were bringing us in about 2 at a time. But the unrest, listen, I can remember leaving the Mountain Lair one day and going to practice. And I walked out, and I mean, it was just a throng of people. And the next thing I know, this bus pulls up, and these state troopers come off the bus in riot gear and had these batons, and there was even tear gas. I mean, they let off some tear gas, I guess, to disperse the crowd, and of course, and then next thing I know, one of the coaches appears, and we're ushered out the side and down to the stadium we went. But and one of the things too that I think the hippies, man. I mean, call it the psychedelic. I mean, that stuff was very prominent back in the '60s. You know, and free love and rainbows, and I mean, the garb, the dress at the time, did quite a bit to kind of quell racial tensions, because they just weren't into that. That group, you know, the free love, everybody was accepted. You know, come on, and the parties, and it was just, it was the best of times, it was the worst of times. But we made it through, and we had a group of African American students, as few as we were in number, but we were together, you know. We were together, and I would say the great majority of them came from strong African American families. I mean, strong, and you could tell the parental influence that was there. I mean, you dare not misbehave. I mean, some of us got kind of, some of them kind of got caught up in the Black Power and, you know, no, we not taking this, and, you know, the clenched fist, and I won't call any names, but I'm sure you, at times as a younger person, if I recall correctly, you attended some of the sporting events in Morgantown, and you witnessed some of that. Well, we had some militant folks there now who just wasn't going to take no craziness from anybody. But again, as an athlete, we were pretty much sheltered and accepted, and felt like, you know, well, it was a difference. I mean, one of the memories that I had as a sophomore, because you couldn't play varsity football as a freshman. And one of my most memorable experiences was, and it's burned into my psyche. I go down for the first game of the season. We're going to play Richmond. And we had our pregame meal. I went to the stadium, and you're going through Woodburn Hall and down to the stadium to get taped and get dressed. And a few people are starting to filter into the stadium, and we get dressed and we come out. And I mean, as a sophomore, you know, to witness for the first time Mountaineer Field, hear 30,000 people, you know, just cheering, and how impressive that was. And then the thought occurred to me, but I can't go certain places. You know, they can cheer for us, and we can get out there on the field and perform and go in and take that shower and get dressed and come out. But you can't go over here, you can't go there because of the color of your skin. Simply because of the color of your skin. And it's something I mean, it's something that becomes a part of you. So that was, but again, you know, not everybody, because I had some good people. I had some very, very good people that I had relationship with. So much so that when I graduated, I was offered a job. His name was Robert Robards, and he was the director of housing. Mr. Robards liked me, and he asked me would I be interested in a position at the university. And I said, sure. You know, let's talk about it. And he created a position, the first of its kind. It was called Off-Campus Housing Advisor. I was the first one to occupy that position. And I think the only African American that has ever worked in that position since. That was in 1972. And I worked there for a couple of years. And then another individual was prominent in my life in Morgantown was a gentleman by the name of Lyle Horton, who owned Lyle Horton Ford Sales out in Saberton. And he was instrumental in brokering for me an opportunity to go to work for the Ford Marketing Corporation in Pittsburgh. So I left Morgantown after a couple of years, after I graduated, and worked a couple of years for the university. Then moved to Pittsburgh to occupy that position with Ford Motor Company. Worked there a couple of years and decided I wanted my master's. So I came back to Morgantown and went to grad school, got my master's degree, and then back to Huntington. Very little had changed, but it was home. It was home. It was comfortable. And then in 1977, I went to work for state government at the time it was called the Governor's Office of Economic and Community Development, GOECD. Rockefeller was governor. And I went to work there for the Employment and Training Division and spent from 77 to 2010. I was at almost 33 years in state government. Number of name changes: Governor's Office of Economic Community Development, Employment and Training Division, and now it is Workforce West Virginia. I had some exposure to the Charleston branch NAACP when Mr. Bernard Hawkins was president. So it was a rather in and out situation. I'd come to some meetings, but most of my time was occupied in working in state government because the equity in employment for African Americans, particularly in state government. I mean, as an example, I started in state government in 1977 with a master's degree for $10,000 a year. That was my starting salary in 1977. So I would go to work in state government, put in my 7.5 hours, come home, change clothes, and go to work at Kroger, where I was putting in 15, 20, 25 hours a week. And during that time, you see some of the inequities. And I'm saying, and I'm looking around and I'm seeing other African Americans who are in similar situations. Thank God for Kroger. I mean, I don't know what I would have done. Open 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. So it was a lifesaver in some respects for me because I needed that to make ends meet. I had 2 kids and a wife. Lived in a mobile home. It was a nice mobile home, but lived in a mobile home. So it was sort of a natural flow, if you will, and remembering my experiences as a youth with the NAACP and then being exposed to some of the inequities here in this area, then I got involved. And then, of course, my association with initially the Temple of Faith, where T.D. Jakes was the minister out in Cross Lanes for several years, and then he left. And of course, my association with you for a number of years in my capacity with state government and the youth programs and the activities that you conducted in this community, in this area, through your nonprofit organization, Hope Community Development Corporation, gave me an on-ramp to get to know you and to get to understand your work, your passion. And, you know, in all honesty, I mean, yours was one of the probably the best youth program. I mean, being in the position I was in, because I was over program operations, and I was very careful not to get too close to you. I mean, because I'm a principled person, and I never wanted there to be any suggestion that, oh, you know, they're friends, so that gives you and your organization an unfair advantage. No. I was a stickler for, as you know, we had plenty of arguments. We had plenty of arguments of you seeing it your way and me seeing it my way. And I was always by the book. The regulations say, our policy says. But your proposals and your youth programs were just exemplary. So we didn't have a problem. Me, my colleagues that I worked with, we did not have a problem in embracing, in fairness and in openness and transparency, awarding federal job training funds to your organization for you to conduct activities pursuant to, at that time, I wasn't CETA. That's because that's what I started on, the Comprehensive Employment Training Act. But I think my relationship with you started under JTPA, Job Training Partnership Act, and it was a rich and rewarding experience. I mean, I think you were successfully funded for probably all of the years that I spent in state government, and did a tremendous job. But I was in that position. That was probably one of the most enjoyable periods of my career. I mean, we handled probably $130, $140 million a year through that federally funded program. Most noticeable, and everybody recognized the summer youth program, which was and all that we did was statewide. It wasn't just in this community. I mean, we funded proposals and programs throughout the 55 counties of the state with those $100+ million. The summer youth program, we put 10, 12,000 kids to work every summer for a 5, 6, 7 week period, paying their wages. We put adults to work statewide under what was then known as the Public Service Employment Program. We funded some small towns and cities and municipalities with police officers, with EMTs and paramedics and water plant operators and clerks in some of the county facilities, and secretaries, and put people to work. And we could pay them up to, not to exceed, $10,000 a year. So that is pretty much how I spent my career in what is we would refer to today as employment and training, economic development activities. Well, my reaction as I entered into the presidency of the Charleston branch of the NAACP to what was going on at the time, it was very surprising to me, being a follower, if you will, of the law, regulations, policies that govern operations, whether they're in state government, county, or city. And it was surprising to me as I began to look at, under the auspices of work with the Tuesday Morning Group, that I also participated with. And as you know, as our discussions evolved around the community and the living conditions of residents within the community, and I began to come to an understanding of what was going on in terms of housing and coming through, if you will, with the experience in state government of economic development, community development, and looking for, well, where are the results? Where are the benefits that should be accruing to residents and people within a community, knowing that I have spent 30 years working in an operation of job training, of economic development, of community development, putting people to work, and then I'm getting a bird's eye view because now I've left that statewide responsibility, and I can now see what is happening in sort of a microcosm within this community. And I'm saying, what in the world is going on? Why are the policies and the laws and the regulations governing community development, economic development, housing, the health, the welfare, the safety of residents, where is it? Because as I looked at the West Side Community Renewal Plan, and I began to read, and I'm saying, wow, 800 plus properties are evaluated by the city, and 81% of those evaluated are residential houses. And they are in such condition that the city evokes Chapter 16 of the West Virginia Code, which is the Urban Renewal Law, and designates the area slum and blight. And I'm saying, well, slum and blight, and then I do more reading because, again, I come from that venue where federal regulations and rules and laws and policies must be adhered to. And now I'm looking at it through another focus, and I'm seeing, well, at the city level, at the county level, the law isn't being followed. The compromise of the health and the welfare and the safety of the residents is being ignored. I mean, it's just call it for what it is. It's being ignored. And I became convinced and began to realize, wow, these folks think they're above the law. I mean, it's just as simple as that. So, again, then I started attending, representing not only the Charleston branch NAACP, but the Tuesday Morning Group. I started to attend the Charleston Urban Renewal Authority meetings. They meet once a month, the second Wednesday of every month, 9 o'clock. And I'm there, sitting in the front seat, watching these Cura commissioners talk about everything and anything but how you address poverty issues, slum and blight, no mention of the West Side Community Renewal Plan. And I'm sitting there waiting to hear an update, to hear something about. And so I said, well, maybe it doesn't happen here. Maybe it happens at city council. So I started attending city council meetings. No mention. So finally, as you are aware, we being the Tuesday morning group primarily, being convened by you we view you as the convener, we began to consider actions that needed to be taken.
Talk about the FOIA request that you made.
Well, that's the way it started. That's exactly the way it started. So we decide to submit a Freedom of Information, submit a request to the Charleston Urban Renewal Authority under the auspices of the Freedom of Information Act. And we requested, our request was very simple. We wanted to know how much money had been spent since the plan was initiated in 2008. What were the projects? What were the results? We asked for a litany of things under the Freedom of Information Act, and after some period of time, they responded. And it became quite obvious. One thing that became immediately obvious was City Council, which has a urban renewal committee, hadn't met for, I don't know, years. Now, the Urban Renewal Committee of City Council and the mayor are the ones that have approved the designation of the west side of Charleston as slum and blight pursuant to the recommendation from CURA, and they don't meet. And what was most alarming, and just, I still ain't over it, was when we began to look at the way money was being spent. I think we discerned that over the course of 2008 to the time of our request in 2016, about $5.3 million had been spent by CURA under the auspices of the West Side Community Renewal Plan, but less, 5.3, but less than 200,000 had been spent on residential slum and blight. And as a matter of fact, we discerned that some money spent had been spent outside of the geographic area covered by the plan. Most notably was the Magic Island. Well, that's not within the CURA footprint covered by the West Side Community Renewal Plan. So we began to realize that there was legitimately some reason to question whether or not the law was being followed. So we began to ask questions at CURA meetings. I even appeared at one city council meeting and publicly ask that someone make a motion. I petitioned city council members when the mayor opened it up, Mayor Danny Jones, when he opened it up for public comment, I made a request that council make a motion and it be seconded to have public hearings to inform the public about the progress of the West Side Community Renewal Plan. How money was being spent, what the projects were. And Tom Lane, I hate to call names, but you just have to do it. Tom Lane was, who was an attorney at a fairly prominent law firm, was at that time functioning as the president of the Charleston City Council, and it appeared in the paper, an article after that meeting, that no, there would be no public hearings. That I was a surrogate of, this was coming from Danny Jones, the mayor, I was a surrogate of Matthew Watts, and I didn't even live in Charleston. I was a resident of Dunbar. It made no difference that I was the president of the Charleston branch of the NAACP and had every legitimate reason to make the request. That didn't matter. So it was just a total resistance to honoring the request, which was a simple request. But what it did do, I think it got the attention. It got the attention of Cura. It got the attention of City Council. It got the attention of the media, of the press. And so the next thing we see, even though public hearings were denied, I mean, it was just unbelievable. The attitude of city council members, that not one had the courage to make a motion and let it die for lack of a second, or make a motion and have it seconded and have it die in lack of, or just turn it down. The votes are no. The majority of votes are no to a public hearing. What in the world? Why would a city council that was intimately involved in designating an area of the city slum and blight, compromising health, wealth, why would they be resistant to a public hearing to talk about the plan? One of the things that we found, and there was an article written by a Gazette reporter, and it talked, I think I want to recall that the headline dealt with that term, resurrection. City of Charleston, or Cura, resurrects a plan, an urban renewal plan that had expired, and the plan was really targeted to what is now called Elk City. Prior to that, it had been referred to as the Near West Side, but there was an obvious attempt to separate Near West Side and refer to it as Elk City. And of course, one of our major issues was, how do you resurrect a plan that has expired and not go through the process that is required by the code to determine that an area is slum and blight? I see no slum and blight in Elk City. But again, there was just this staunch resistance to the issue of being in violation of the code, being in violation of the law, though we felt strongly that they were aware. And they began to do some things to kind of counter that. Never do I recall there being discussion about the East End community renewal plan, because there's one there as well. If you go to the Cura website and you look at the links, one of which deals with active plans, there's also an East End plan that, to my knowledge, you hear very little, if anything, about, and the conditions there almost mirror the conditions on the west side. But in between, downtown, Elk City, the $5.3 million, if you look at the expenditure of dollars particularly in the commercial area, the streetscapes and the facades, and how the money is spent. You know, I am more than convinced that if there were truly an investigative report, if you know some of these reporters that really deal with investigative reporting, if you laid out the 2008 West Side Community Renewal Plan, now let me back up, lay out a snapshot and summary of the Triangle District, lay that out.
Explain what the triangle district is.
Well, the Triangle District was an area which is now downtown Charleston, the post office, the water plant, that area of Charleston, the mall. Yes, the mall. That area during the 60s and 70s was a predominantly African American area. Churches, businesses, residential housing, the Triangle District, and what happened during the 60s into the early 70s when you saw what would be commonly referred to in these days as just a total devastation of a community where through the efforts of progress and urban renewal, you move families and businesses and churches. You move them out of an area to make room for public services, the water plant, the interstate system that we now commonly refer to as I-64. But under the auspices of eminent domain, the city and urban renewal authority come in and designate an area that is predominantly African American, residential businesses are just demolished, wiped out. And people are, people stand up in protest and offer an alternative plan. Consider doing things a little differently, such that single-family housing is preserved and there is a swath of property that would still remain viable as it relates to safe, affordable housing for families and businesses, while still creating opportunity for progress. But it was denied. There was a formation of a Triangle Improvement Council. This area was so entrenched and so viable that they had two members from that community on city council. An outside attorney was brought in, I think, from New York to assist in developing alternative plans, and they were presented. But over 100 people showed up at the city council meeting when the plan came up for a vote. And unfortunately, in spite of all of the efforts and very legitimate rationale, the plan was approved. And people were relocated, churches, residential housing demolished. On the corner where the current J.C. Penney exists as a part of the mall, I think at that time it was a church valued at, I think when the offer made to the church was 100 plus 118,000. That property today is assessed at over $1 million, which shows just the gentrification, just the devastation of, and people are scattered everywhere. I mean, when we talk about 1,800, we're talking about families whose lives were uprooted, and they were scattered everywhere. Some went to Rand, some went to Dunbar, some went to Institute, some went to the West Side, some went to the East End. But I think it did a lot to totally demoralize. When you feel like you have no voice, when you feel like all of the forces are against you, in spite of legitimate data documentation of what it is doing to a community, to people. Now, I'm convinced that if you lay that out next to the West Side Community Renewal Plan, the Bad Buildings Report, the amendments to the West Side Community Development Plan, now we're talking about a swath of time that runs from almost 50 years. From 1960 into the early 70s to the present day, you're talking about almost 50 years. And it is without a doubt a consistent, thorough plan that demoralizes, that marginalizes a population that is predominantly African American. And when you look at the introductory wording of the Bad Buildings Report, of the community development plan, the West Side Community Development Plan, you see the language. I mean, they openly talk about gentrification. They openly talk about discrimination. They openly talk about the devastation of a poor community, the isolation of a poor community, the impact that it had on the African American population, including the involvement of banks with loans for residential housing, and how African Americans it was made almost impossible for them to deal with the lending institutions for mortgages. So again, at the end of the day, so to speak, 50 years from the devastation that took place with the Triangle District, downtown Charleston, to the present day, it is not a heavy lift to connect the dots that show, and I like to use the term, though I'm no lawyer, I like to use the term with a preponderance of evidence that racism, discrimination, violation of laws has occurred and continue to. Now, that's my opinion. Like I said, I'm no lawyer, but I'm saying lay it out and look at it. It's not a heavy lift. It's not a lot to look at. And by the virtue of some of the wording in these plans, there is an admission that discrimination has occurred. First of all, with respect to the opportunity zone that was created as a part of the current Trump administration tax reform plan, the designation of opportunity zones in West Virginia came as somewhat of a surprise to us. We knew nothing about it. We were certainly not questioned or ask for any input as the city, as the West Virginia Department of Commerce made the decision to recommend certain areas of the state to be so designated as an opportunity zone. At the end of the day, when the recommendations were finalized and submitted, it was just, again, such an insult to the African American community in particular that that the West Side was, and the census tracts within the West Side that are clearly areas covered by the West Side Community Renewal Plan. So there's poverty, there's slum and blight, there's again the compromise of health and safety and welfare and benefit of the residents, but excluded. It was excluded in the zones that were recommended to be designated as opportunity zone areas, which, you know, the rationale is you designate these areas as opportunity zones to attract investment, to attract the establishment of safe, affordable housing, businesses, things that will contribute to the viability of a community, excluded. So when you consider that, and then you consider amendments to the West Side Community Renewal Plan, which was another one of your points, as it relates to what is it to do for the citizens, then you have consultants that are commissioned, if you will, by the Charleston Urban Renewal Authority to assist in the development of the amendments to the plan. They hold a number of meetings and develop a plan that, in my review of the amendments, do very little as it relates to a benefit to creating more decent, safe, affordable, particularly single-family housing, in that some of what is proposed in the plan we know will never happen. One of the outstanding examples to sort of buoy that feeling that it will never happen is they've designated within the amended plan some properties where they are showing the opportunity for infill and the building of new housing. The property belongs to churches. They haven't even talked to the churches. And the churches have no interest in selling that property for the construction of residential housing. Even the mayor has indicated some problem with a part of the plan that is designated for a recreational field. So it's just in the review of the amended plan, I believe, that the opinions are accurate and correct, that much of what's in that plan will never happen. It wasn't until the Tuesday Morning Group, again under your convening, sent a letter to the Charleston Urban Renewal Authority indicating and making some suggestions and recommendations as it relates to things that were missing in the amended plan, not the least of which was their reference to catalytic projects and how their reference to the catalytic projects included building on property owned by the churches at the exclusion of catalytic projects that were already underway and close to completions. And the most notable being the area around Mary C. Snow West Side Elementary that heretofore was designated as a home ownership zone, where Hope Community Development Corporation is building 10 townhouses. But there is no reference to that in the amended plan as it relates to a model of what a catalytic project should look like, could look like, and how it benefits the community in terms of addressing slum and blight and creating safe, decent, affordable housing. It's just a total omission, almost intentional. I mean, let's just be real and speak truth, have the courage to speak truth, and that's what we find, that there is a resistance, an unwillingness, and I don't really know why. I mean, you know, you feel like at times, do we overdo this issue of racism and discrimination? Or are these just terms that we throw around with no validity? I don't think so. Again, there's the preponderance of evidence in my mind that clearly demonstrate that there is willful intent as it relates to marginalizing and continuing to marginalize residents within a community. In my opinion, I believe moving forward with respect to to amendments to the West Side Community Renewal Plan, I am cautiously optimistic that there will be, and I'm prayerfully hoping that there will be a rising up of the community, similar to what was seen back during the 60s and early 70s with the Triangle District, that people's sense of morality, of fairness, of following the law will touch a nerve in such a way that as these public hearings, which are now required, once city council receives a recommendation from CURA to approve the amendments to the plan, CURA will be directed by city council with that approval to announce public hearings as required by the code. I don't know whether CURA will do it or the city council will do it or the Urban Renewal Committee of City Council will do it. It may rest there, that they will call for public hearings, and at which time I am again cautiously optimistic. I know we plan to do all that we can do as the Charleston branch NAACP, and I feel quite confident as a member of the Tuesday Morning Group that we will speak out as it relates to compliance with the law, as it relates to a lack of specificity within the amended plan as it relates to residential housing, infill opportunities that were on the First Avenue section of the West Side was not where there are a number of vacant lots. I don't know, 18 plus vacant lots that might realistically create an opportunity for infill and development of safe, affordable housing, single family as well as multifamily, but were not a part of the initial amendments. We believe that, again, using the term light lift and just common sense, why would you not include that area as a part of the plan? So we'll see. And you know, I'm also of the firm opinion that if respectful, diplomatic, open conversation and suggestions, reasonable suggestions, are not adopted, then from my vantage point, I think the only option left is to file suit, is to look at the opportunity to engage through the judicial process, ask for a temporary injunction, ask the courts to cease and desist, approve a cease and desist order as it relates to implementation of the amendments until these issues can be appropriately vetted by counsel as it relates to compliance with the law. Because that was our position from the very beginning, and it has not changed. All we asked for was to follow the law. Is it time for the community to stand up and remember the Triangle District, the resistance posed by the residents back in the 60s? It is definitely time for that to occur. And I, again, am prayerfully hopeful that with what's going on here, with the creation of this video, and with the remembering of the Triangle District, and putting the two together, that people will be able to see and understand in an economy of videos and testimonies and interviews that in some respects we've made very, very little progress in 50 years. And the legacy for our children and our grandchildren, I think, will depend largely on this moment in time and what we do with this current plan that is being amended. And with what is going to occur with the Opportunity Zone. It's just so much happening now and coming together at this time that if we do not seize this opportunity in this moment in time, I fear that I fear that we may never recover. We may never recover. My understanding is their funding comes through the acquisition of rental property. They also own, if you will, the property where the town center sits. So that's leased property. They get the revenues generated by the parking garage. That comes in to the Cura coffers. So that is essentially where there is obviously a lack of their attempt to acquire additional funding. I mean, they could write grants. They could submit for various funding from other sources. An example would be the West Virginia Housing Development Fund. Cooperative agreements that they could enter into that would create a revenue stream. Cura accrues money from ground where the town center sits, which was at one time a part of the Triangle District. As I indicated, the property where I think the J.C. Penney store was a African-American church. It was either Shiloh or it was one of the African-American churches. And an article appeared in the paper not long ago that talked about how when that occurred and the offer made to acquire that property from the church was, I think, like $118,000. is what they acquired that property for under the auspices of eminent domain. And the property now, the value is in excess of $1 million. In terms of ownership of property, where I lived in Huntington growing up, there was a mixture of families that owned their homes and those that rented within our community. And I would say the majority was rental property. The ownership of property in the community where I lived was ownership where rental property was owned. It was owned by people outside the community, and predominantly, if not 100%, Caucasian. There were not, to my recollection, at the time I was growing up in that community in the late 50s, early 60s, there were not African Americans who owned property who lived outside the community and rented to African American families that lived within the community, not to my knowledge. I don't recall any incidents at a movie theater in Huntington in the 60s. Now, I do recall, obviously, some racial tension and unrest, as I indicated. As I was growing up, the movie theater was segregated. And the two of the three were. And the only way we could attend the one, the Orpheum, was to sit in the balcony. Some of the eating establishments, I mentioned the White Pantry restaurant, did not allow African Americans there. I can remember in high school, there was some racial unrest, feeling like there was not representation. Cheerleading squad was primarily the issue. I distinctly remember my senior year, after I had signed my scholarship to attend West Virginia University, that there was an incident where African American athletes threatened to boycott and not participate in sports if there was not a African American female selected to be a cheerleader. So yeah, there were instances in my high school days. I remember one incident where they called in the National Guard because of some racial tensions. There had been a physical altercation between an African American student and a Caucasian student. An actual fight broke out in the school during the lunch hour. And there was a standoff, if you will, African American students on one side of the street and Caucasians on the other, and in rolls the National Guard. So, yeah, and this was, late 60s. I can recall the relationship between African American community and law enforcement in Huntington was, to my recollection as a child growing up, was pretty good. I remember his name was Mr. Sam. We called him Mr. Sam. He was an African American motorcycle officer. And everybody knew him. I mean, obviously, we were just kind of in awe of the motorcycle and his regalia with the with the hard hat on, and there was another African American officer lived in the community, Walter Davis. I never shall forget him. He was married, as a matter of fact, to my sister's best friend. So Walter Davis was an officer, and there was contact. I mean, they would come into the community, and Mr. Sam would get off his bike, and the kids would, gather around and talk. Now, Caucasian officers, I don't remember seeing any relationship there, but nor do I recollect any tension, any confrontation, as we see it oftentimes today, between African American citizens within our community and law enforcement. And I think that much of that is attributed to the fact that we're a gentle people, or at least we were then, and law-abiding citizens. There was very little reason for there to be confrontation because activities were confined. We weren't dispersed throughout the community in every part of Huntington, so there was really no need for confrontation. Though from time to time racial issues would arise, but they were I think rare. Not to say that there was not an element, but I think it was more a professional element that was appealing to the city for fairness, for equality. I can remember, and there's an office within state government today that is named after a very prominent African American attorney that lived within our community, Herbert H. Henderson. We have the Herbert Henderson Office of Minority Affairs that is a part of state government to this day, named in his honor. Well, Mr. Henderson, Attorney Henderson, was the state president of the State Conference of Branches, NAACP, and he was also a national board member of the national NAACP, as was my pastor. The pastor of my church, Reverend Charles H. Smith, was also a national board member of the NAACP. So you had two very prominent African American leaders within our community who had access, if you will, to city administration. And they were consistently advocating for fairness, for equality. So I think that did a lot to perhaps minimize any type of confrontational issues from government. Because Herb, we called him Herb, it was an endearment thing. Attorney Henderson was a very, very staunch, strong professional advocate. And he's an attorney, so he knew the law. Reverend Charles H. Smith was well known and created, they together, Rotary Gardens that exist in Huntington, which is a low-income housing complex in Huntington. Attorney Henderson and Reverend Smith were largely responsible for and instigated the construction and the funding for that low-income housing complex. I'm somewhat familiar with when he moved out of the African-American community. He had a residence on, I think, 8th Avenue at one point in time, he and his family, and he moved out of what we would consider the African-American community to the predominantly white area of Huntington, And yeah, there was an incident where there was a cross burning. I do remember that. Of course, being an attorney and being as vocal, and I just remember Attorney Henry. He was a big man, and there was just a force about him and an influence. Now, I can't speak to what the outcome was, but as I recall, I don't remember him giving up his home and moving back to the African American community. So I think it was the beginning. It was the beginning of, well, if he can do it, maybe I can do it too. I remember Dr. Gunn, who was my dentist at the time, and his office is still on what is now Helger Boulevard, 16th Street, between 10th Avenue and 9th Avenue. It's just a little tiny brick building, but his son and his he's now deceased, not his son, but Dr. Gunn, and his son and his wife, his son's wife, are now dentists that have continued their dentistry practice in the black community. The jobs that were predominantly available to African Americans from my community growing up, I never shall forget. They were good jobs. I mean, ENCO, we called it ENCO, the nickel plant, was one of the primary employers of African American males during the years that I was growing up in the community. Owens, Illinois, the glass plant located in Huntington. Houda Hershey. Houda Hershey was a manufacturer of car bumpers located in the west end of Huntington. And they were a major employer of African American. ACF Car Foundry on 3rd Avenue, right across from what is now the Marshall Stadium, football stadium. Well, it's defunct now, but back during the time that I was growing up, it was booming. So between the nickel plant, Owens, Illinois, ACF, and city government, including the police department, the hospital, Cabell Huntington Hospital, St. Mary's Hospital. There was pretty much what I would consider, as I recall it growing up, full employment for anybody that wanted to work. My mother, but there was still covert, and in some cases I would say overt, but there was still covert racism that occurred. And my mother, who passed away in 2017 at 100 years old, was an example of what I would consider blatant racism. My mother had 3 years of college, spoke French fluently, was an avid reader, never missed working an election. She was a ward captain, and she worked in housekeeping at the CMP Telephone Company, mopping the floors, cleaning the bathrooms, dusting the switchboard for operators who only had to have a high school degree. But she could not be one. When I was playing ball in high school, My senior year, I was one of the co-captains, and we had an undefeated season. We went 10-0. And my mother's supervisor put her on a shift. She had typically worked 7 in the morning to 3:30 in the afternoon. He changed her shift to like 4 in the evening to midnight, which meant she couldn't come to my games. But she was a determined individual. She was strong-willed. So she would take her lunch hour and come to watch at least a part of my games when I was a senior in high school. But it was done deliberately, and she protested, I think, filed a grievance, and her grievance was denied. But, that was just how it was. But she had a job, and she was able to provide for me and my sister. And my sister was able to, after graduating from Douglas High School, she was a number of years older than me, but she was able to go on to vocational school and acquire her LPN license, and she worked as a nurse at Cabell Huntington Hospital before moving to Columbus to take a position at the hospital there. So, I mean, the issue of employment, yeah, it was there, but was there discrimination within employment? Yeah, sure. You're not going to you weren't going to find African Americans in managerial, supervisory positions back during that time. In terms of my return to Huntington after my period of formal education, if you will, at WVU, I never really returned to Huntington to spend any permanent time. My stay in Huntington after I acquired my master's degree from WVU was I matriculated because I had taken a position in state government. So I commuted from Huntington to Charleston. But my recollection of things in Huntington at that time, yeah, they had really started to decline. The nickel plant was laying off. They were not hiring. Many of the older people, fortunately, had been able to retire. Those that, as I was growing up as a kid, who were working there were of the age that they could retire. Owens, Illinois, was laying off. All of the plants were. ACF, I think, at that time was on the decline because I worked at both of those plants in the summer as a summer employment. The university, that's one of the things that the athletic department would do. They would help arrange for summer employment. So I worked at Houda Hershey. I worked at ACF during the summer. I worked at the State Highway Commission one summer. But all of those employment venues by the late 70s, early 80s were in decline as it related to employment opportunity. And not to mention the insurgence, if you will, of some of the problems with drugs and that were starting to surface at that time. Well, I would simply say to the issue of acceptance and the example that I related coming out on Mountaineer Field for the first time and to the cheers of the crowd and the feeling of acceptance, the feeling that color made no difference because we were performing. And did I experience similar feelings in other venues? I would say not until or unless there was recognition of me as an athlete at WVU. Once there was identification, association with that, then the dynamic would change.
Right.
It was Rick Martin, football player at WVU, not Rick Martin, an African American male. And that's all we know of him. That's all we see of him. So yeah, there was definitely a different dynamic